I didn't say a word when the HOA president leaned over the polished oak table and barked something about encroachment and unauthorized use of common land. I just laid the developer's recorded map on the table, the one from 1973 showing the property lines in precise ink and seal, and watched her color drain from her face. Their lawyer shuffled papers nervously, clearly trying to find some clause or covenant that might save them, but there wasn't one. The quiet in that room was heavy, almost tactile, and I could see the tension radiating from the board members like heat off asphalt in August. Nobody moved, nobody dared speak. I sipped my coffee slowly, as if we were all just in a normal Tuesday morning meeting, while in reality, the entire HOA's claim to that strip of land I'd inherited was dissolving beneath them. That map had been sitting in a county archive for decades, collecting dust and obscurity, but in my hands it was lethal. It was funny, in a cold way, how absolute and simple the truth could be. They had spent years operating as if that land were theirs, and now one folded, yellowed sheet of paper wiped all of it away. Before any of that started, before fines and letters and endless meetings, my life was quiet in the way I'd hoped it would be when I moved out here. I wasn't trying to start anything. I just wanted a peaceful corner of the world, somewhere I could fix up my grandfather's cabin, fish in the small creek that ran along the western edge of my property, and maybe grow old without interference. The land itself had a kind of rough elegance. Pines and oaks stretched into the sky, interrupted by patches of moss-covered stone and wildflowers I hadn't planted but loved anyway. I spent mornings checking on the small vegetable patch I'd managed to coax from stubborn soil, afternoons on the porch reading or sketching, evenings watching the sun set through the mist over the distant hills. The peace was intoxicating but fragile. It felt like it might break if anyone so much as dropped a hammer too close to the boundary. I never asked for drama, but apparently it finds you whether you want it or not. The first inkling of trouble came one Wednesday morning, in the form of a yellowed envelope taped to my garage door. The HOA had fined me for trespassing on common land. My jaw must have dropped when I read the notice, because I stood there for several minutes trying to locate this mythical patch of property that I supposedly shouldn't be walking on. Their description was vague, something about the East Buffer Strip, but every step I took over that land had been well within the lines marked in my grandfather's original deed. I tried to reconcile it in my mind. I didn't feel anger yet, only confusion. The notice was almost absurd, a board of suburban homeowners claiming a piece of forest that had been in my family's possession since the developer sold off the plots in the early 70s. I could almost hear them whispering behind their office doors, convinced they'd found some loophole. I tried diplomacy at first, the way you do when you think people have just misunderstood. I sent polite emails with scanned copies of my deed, asked for clarification, suggested a meeting to resolve any confusion. Days passed, then weeks. Replies were rare, and when they came, they were thinly veiled mockery. Your property lines do not match our community survey. One letter said, as if an email typed in Comic Sans could somehow overwrite decades of county records. I realized quickly that my quiet attempts at reason were treated like jokes. And more importantly, they emboldened the board to escalate. Fines increased, letters became more threatening, and the HOA president began personally appearing near my driveway, as if her presence alone could intimidate me into submission. That was the moment I stopped sending emails and started reading property law. Nights grew longer and more deliberate. I visited the county archives, dug up maps, plats, and surveys. I measured, photographed, and documented everything. The old fence posts my grandfather had erected, the stone markers hidden under years of leaf litter, the creek that curved precisely along the legal boundary. The neighborhood, once friendly, grew quiet. Some neighbors avoided me, whispering when they passed, others simply stared. My family felt the tension too. My partner worried about confrontation. My kids asked questions I couldn't answer with, "It's complicated." But I embraced the isolation. I wasn't angry. I was preparing. Methodically, quietly, powerfully. I obtained the developer's recorded map, the same one that now sits on the table in front of them. It was stamped, sealed, and perfectly clear. The land they claimed was mine. Every inch, over the following months, I became almost nocturnal, moving through the archives like a ghost. I traced every property transfer, every easement, every amendment in the covenants and restrictions. I learned to read surveyor shorthand, to translate the developer's precise measurements into something the HOA couldn't ignore. I cross-referenced plat maps from the 1970s with modern GIS records, noticing the subtle discrepancies that the board had somehow relied on to justify their false claims. Every late night spent with a ruler, a scanner, and a magnifying glass added pieces to a puzzle that no one in the neighborhood seemed interested in solving. Even my partner stopped asking why I spent hours on boring old papers, because the tension had taught them it was pointless to interfere with the methodical calm I had found. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful in the ordinary sense. I was meticulous. I also began documenting everything in the field. Photos of the fence lines, measurements of trees planted long before the HOA existed, GPS coordinates of survey markers, even recordings of board members boasting to neighbors about their common land acquisitions. I kept a binder that became unwieldy, filled with stacks of legal documents, copies of emails, and photographs, all indexed with careful precision. My kids would occasionally peek at it, eyes wide, but I only smiled and told them it was homework for adults who care about fairness. In truth, it was the foundation for the moment I knew would come. The moment where the HOA's power could be quietly, surgically removed without a single shout or confrontation. I chose the board meeting for the reveal. It was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the small conference room at the community center. The room smelled of polished linoleum and stale coffee. Members shuffled in, folding their hands on the table, smiling politely to each other. They didn't know what was coming. I arrived with nothing but my binder and a sense of absolute calm. As the discussion turned, as the president began to pontificate on the so-called encroachment, I laid the developer's recorded map flat in the center of the table. I didn't raise my voice, didn't gesture dramatically, didn't make a scene. I just said, "This map shows the legal boundaries of my parcel. The land you claim as common property has always been mine." The effect was immediate. Silence. The president's face went pale. Her hands, usually so confident as they tapped out fines and notices, froze. Their lawyer opened his mouth and then closed it again, realizing there was no legal foot to stand on. I guided them slowly through the map, pointing out the survey markers, the deed references, the recorded plat numbers. Each document I had collected over the preceding months supported the claim. Each photograph corroborated it. It was not theatrical. It was undeniable. I watched as years of petty bullying, fines, and intimidation evaporated under the weight of meticulous legality. By the time the meeting adjourned, the board had no choice but to acknowledge the error. Some members mumbled about misunderstandings or clerical oversights, but the records were clear. The strip of land, the very same that had been the spark for months of harassment, was mine. In the following days, official notices were sent out. The HOA president resigned quietly, the lawyer moved on, and the board agreed to formally amend the community map, officially recognizing my ownership. Neighbors who had watched the months-long tension unfold treated me differently. Some nodded respectfully when we passed on the road. Others avoided eye contact entirely. There was no applause, no cheering, just quiet acknowledgement. The sort I had come to value, life returned to its previous rhythms, but with subtle differences. I could walk my land without fear of a fine. The creek sparkled the same way it had before, but now with a small satisfaction, a quiet proof of persistence and patience. My family no longer flinched at the sight of yellow envelopes on the garage door. Even the cabin felt more settled, anchored not just in wood and stone but in legitimacy. There was no gloating, no desire for revenge beyond the justice itself. It was the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, is more powerful than anger, threats, or loud confrontation. I sometimes reflect on those months, the isolation, the nights in the archives, the meticulous documentation, and I, Realized that the process changed me as much as it changed the HOA. I learned that calm preparation, patience, and respect for legal processes can dismantle pretension and abuse more effectively than fury. Now, when I drive past the community center, I see the HOA board meeting room through the windows and smile faintly. They are still there, still holding meetings, but there is a quiet deference in the air. The land is mine, unassailable, and the neighborhood, for all its human pettiness, has settled into a new rhythm, one grounded in clarity, fairness, and undeniable fact. That in itself is a kind of peace I had not anticipated, but one I value far more than I could have imagined back when a yellow notice first appeared on my garage door. I didn't move a muscle when the HOA president slammed her binder onto the polished table, rattling the papers inside. She was red-faced, her tone sharp with indignation, yelling about trespassing and unauthorized occupation of land they had, until that very second, pretended belonged to them. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Years of intimidation, fines and threats, all predicated on a lie, and now, in this quiet room filled with fluorescent light and the faint hum of the vehicle, everything was about to unravel. I placed my own binder flat on the table, the edges of the pages worn from months of late-night handling, the corners dog-eared where the maps and deeds lived. It wasn't theatrics. It was the culmination of months of careful documentation. Slowly, deliberately, I opened to the developer's recorded map from 1973. The one that clearly delineated the parcel lines that the HOA had spent years claiming as common property. Their lawyer shuffled his papers, fumbling for some clause or covenant that might save them. But the look on his face told me everything. There wasn't one. I didn't speak immediately. I let the quiet stretch, thick and heavy, until it felt almost visible. The board members shifted in their chairs, unsure, uncomfortable. They weren't used to calm confrontation backed by meticulous fact. They were used to shouting, to letters, to fear. I sipped my coffee slowly, an almost casual gesture, and watched the tension coil tighter in the room. The president's hands, which had seemed so commanding when issuing fines or posting threatening notices, were now tight fists resting on the table. Her confidence was gone, replaced with something akin to disbelief, or perhaps fear, though I could not be sure. Before this moment, life had been simple in a way I had thought unassailable. When I first moved here, I was looking for a quiet corner of the world, a place where the noise of the city and the weight of bureaucracy would not follow. I wasn't seeking power, confrontation, or recognition. I wanted mornings spent with a cup of coffee on the porch of my grandfather's cabin, afternoons casting a line into the creek that wound along the western edge of my property, evenings tending a small vegetable garden, coaxing stubborn tomatoes and zucchini from soil enriched by decades of quiet care. The land itself was a character in my life, pines that reached skyward, oaks with branches thick enough to hold a rope swing, moss-covered stones that marked the passage of years. I would often pause in the mornings, inhaling the smell of damp pine needles and the faintly sweet aroma of the creek, and feel an almost physical sense of peace, but that peace was fragile, easily disturbed by people who mistook authority for omnipotence. The first indication of trouble came with an innocuous-looking yellow envelope taped to my garage door on a Wednesday morning. It was stiff, creased, and printed with the HOA's usual threats: trespassing on common land, immediate fine imposed. I remember staring at it for a long time, trying to locate this non-existent common land, they claimed. The description was deliberately vague, the east buffer strip adjacent to Lot 12B. But every step I took on that land was within the boundaries of the parcel my grandfather had purchased from the developer decades before. I felt confusion first, not anger. The absurdity of it was almost comical. A suburban board wielding imaginary authority over trees, rocks, and dirt. At first, I attempted diplomacy. I sent emails politely outlining the discrepancy, attaching copies of my deed, offering to meet and clarify any misunderstanding. Weeks passed. Replies, if they came, were thinly veiled mockery. One letter suggested my boundaries do not match the community survey. As though a typed document could override recorded legal history, I realized that reason and civility were met with scorn. Fines increased, letters became more threatening, and the president herself began showing up near my property, watching, waiting, perhaps hoping that intimidation would succeed where law and logic had failed. That was when I stopped sending emails and began studying property law. My nights became long and deliberate. I spent hours in the county archives, poring over plats, deeds, and survey maps. I learned to read surveyor shorthand to identify the exact coordinates and markers that defined ownership. I documented every post, stone, and natural marker on my land. I photographed fences, mapped creek boundaries, and measured distances with precision. Each discovery built a lattice of evidence I could not yet use, but which would eventually dismantle the HOA's entire case. My family noticed the late nights, the quiet intensity, but I did not explain. I didn't need to. The preparation itself, the accumulation of undeniable truth, became my form of control. As weeks turned into months, my documentation became obsessive. Every letter sent by the HOA, every fine, every assertion of authority was cross-referenced against the historical record. I pulled building permits, zoning maps, and archival photographs from decades past. Each layer confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA's claim to that strip of land was entirely without foundation. I also began capturing photographic and written evidence of board members' statements, remarks overheard from neighbors, even casual boasts about their supposed ownership of areas clearly outside their legal control. It wasn't malicious. It was strategic. Every piece of information was a piece of the puzzle that would lead to their undoing. The day I chose to reveal my findings was calm, almost anticlimactic to the outside observer. A Tuesday evening, the community center, the same fluorescent light and beige walls as any other meeting. Board members arrived early, folding their hands, greeting each other with polite, rehearsed smiles. They were unaware of what I had in my binder, unaware that the painstaking months of research, nights in the archives, and hours of fieldwork had culminated in an incontrovertible presentation. I set the binder down on the table. I did not gesture, did not raise my voice. I simply opened it to the developer's recorded map, the ink slightly faded, the seal crisp and official. "This map," I said quietly, "shows the legal boundaries of my parcel. The land you claim as common property is in fact mine." The silence was immediate and complete. The president's face went pale. Their lawyer, accustomed to confidently issuing threats and reviewing unsigned notices, closed his mouth and froze. The board members shifted in their chairs, whispering to each other, fumbling with their own papers as the facts sank in. I guided them through the evidence calmly, pointing out survey markers, deed numbers, recorded plat references. Each document, each photograph, each cross-reference built a lattice of undeniable truth. They could argue tone or intent or misunderstanding, but they could not argue the maps, the deeds, or the law. In the weeks that followed, the board quietly amended community records, acknowledging the correct parcel boundaries. The president resigned without fanfare. The lawyer moved on to another firm. No one in the neighborhood made a public spectacle of the reversal. Neighbors, some curious, some quietly supportive, adjusted to the new reality. When I drove past the community center, heads would nod politely, some averted their gaze. The land finally was recognized as mine. There were no celebrations, no applause. Just quiet, measured acknowledgement. Life returned to its previous rhythms, but subtly transformed. The creek sparkled in the same way, the pines whispered in the same wind. But now each step across my property carried a quiet sense of validation. The cabin, the garden, the small corners of my land I had nurtured were not just safe from fines or intimidation, they were legally and publicly recognized. My family moved freely again. The late nights of research, the solitary hours in archives, had produced not only justice, but peace. I realized in those moments of quiet reflection that the calm, measured preparation, grounded in undeniable truth and careful legal documentation, was more powerful than anger, more effective than shouting or threats. The HOA had been undone not by noise or spectacle, but by patient, methodical strategy. And that, I realized, was the quietest, most satisfying victory of all. The weeks after the board meeting passed in an almost surreal quiet. The HOA, which had once been an omnipresent shadow over my life, became almost invisible. Their threats, fines, and letters ceased. The president's resignation had left a vacuum of authority that no one was eager to fill. New members were elected quietly, chosen more for availability than ambition, and the meetings themselves lost their once authoritative edge. They still gathered, still passed motions about landscaping standards or holiday decorations, but there was a subtle wariness in their demeanor when our property was mentioned. I could see it in the careful phrasing of emails, in the measured tones of phone calls. No one dared dispute the boundaries again. My ownership was no longer a claim. It was a fact, backed by decades of documentation, county records, and a carefully preserved developer's map. Neighbors reacted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some nodded politely when I drove past, others avoided eye contact entirely. A few approached me quietly, acknowledging what had happened without fuss or spectacle. One elderly couple, whose property bordered the disputed strip, stopped by to hand me a small basket of apples from their orchard. They murmured something about finally having peace in the neighborhood and thanked me for persevering. There was no fanfare, no applause. The satisfaction lay in the restoration of normalcy, the affirmation of law and order, and the quiet validation that comes from being right when everyone else doubts you. My family, too, felt the relief in subtle ways. My partner no longer flinched at the sound of an envelope hitting the garage door. Our children could play freely along the creek and in the woods, no longer anxious about fines or threats. We began holding small gatherings on the property again, friends over for dinner or a quiet evening by the fire. The land that had been a source of stress transformed back into what I had sought all along, a sanctuary. The cabin, the creek, the garden, even the narrow trails through the pines became symbols of resilience, patience, and calm authority. Even the mundane aspects of neighborhood life changed. Board meetings, once tense with unspoken threats, became procedural. Their discussions no longer carried the weight of intimidation. Occasionally, I would attend, mostly out of habit, observing the subtle shifts in demeanor. A member would glance at me, remembering the maps, the deeds, the quiet authority I had displayed. The balance of power had shifted permanently, but invisibly, without confrontation, without spectacle. I had not humiliated them in public or broadcast their mistakes to the world. Instead, I had allowed the truth to speak for itself. And in that, there was a satisfaction deeper than any applause could offer. I often think back to the nights spent in the county archives, the meticulous cataloging of deeds and surveys, the hours hunched over maps and spreadsheets. Those solitary months were more than preparation. They were lessons in patience, strategy, and the power of calm intelligence. My emotional transformation mirrored the legal one. I had learned not just to defend my property, but to wield authority without anger, to let facts speak louder than threats. My confidence grew not from confrontation, but from certainty in the law, in the documentation, and in the methodical approach I had taken. The HOA, for its part, did not retaliate. The president's resignation, combined with the new members' cautious approach, ensured that no further disputes arose. Any attempts to reassert authority were met with polite, legally backed reminders of the property lines, the recorded map, and the evidence that I had carefully preserved. They learned quickly that their previous tactics, intimidation, fines, threats, were ineffective against preparation grounded in law and patience. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, gradually shifted toward stability. Some neighbors, having witnessed the outcome, began to respect boundaries and procedures more seriously. Others, having learned the limits of HOA authority, simply focused on their own plots, leaving me and my family to our quiet routines. Even now, years later, the satisfaction remains. The land is mine, unassailable, and the lessons linger. Calm persistence, careful documentation, and a deep understanding of legal authority can dismantle pretension and abuse more effectively than anger or spectacle ever could. The creek flows as it always has, the pines whisper with each breeze, and the cabin stands firmly on its rightful land. I can walk the property without fear or hesitation, knowing that the quiet assertion of fact and law has restored not only my property but my peace of mind. Occasionally, when I drive past the community center or the HOAS meeting room, I catch a glimpse of the board members inside. They glance up, perhaps recalling that evening when a folded binder and a developer's map shifted the balance of authority without a single raised voice. They still hold meetings, still pass motions, but their gestures are tempered by the knowledge that their power is limited by law, by documentation, and by patience. I smile faintly, sip my coffee, and continue along my path. The victory is quiet, subtle, and complete, and in the end, that quiet is everything. No gloating, no spectacle, just the enduring satisfaction that comes from being meticulous, prepared, and fundamentally right. That is the real measure of justice, and in my corner of the world it has been restored.